In the aftermath of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini's death in custody in September 2022, protests erupted across Iran, initially sparked by her tragic passing at the hands of the morality police. What began as an outcry over one woman's death evolved into a broader uprising against the oppressive Islamic Republic regime. However, the government's response was brutal, resulting in the unlawful killings of at least 23 children between September 20th and 30th, 2022, as security forces used live ammunition, metal pellets, and violent beatings to crush the protests. Amnesty International reported that the victims included 20 boys aged between 11 and 17 and 3 girls, aged 16 and 17. Many of the children were shot at close range with live ammunition, while others were killed by fatal beatings from security forces. The most harrowing case involved 11-year-old Javad Pashe, who was shot in the back of the head during a protest in Zehedan. 10 of the children killed were from Iran's oppressed Baluchi minority, with the deadliest day of the crackdown occurring on September 30th, when at least 7 children were shot in vital organs in Zehedan. Other children were killed in protests in Tehran, West Azerbaijan, and other provinces. Among the victims were 2 Afghan children, 14-year-old Mohammad Reza Sarvari and 17-year-old Satare Tajik, both killed during protests. The authorities attempted to cover up their involvement by spreading false narratives. Mohammad Reza Sarvari's burial certificate showed he died from a fast-moving projectile, yet the government claimed the deaths were suicides or accidents. Amnesty International condemned the Iranian regime's actions, with Hiba Morayev, the organization's regional director for the Middle East and North Africa, questioning how the international community could look these children and their families in the eye. Despite global outcry, the Iranian authorities have continued their violent repression, showing complete impunity for their crimes. The children's deaths represent 16% of the total casualties recorded by Amnesty International during the protests. This tragedy is part of a broader pattern of lethal force used by Iranian security forces, as seen in past protests, such as the November 2019 crackdown, which also resulted in the deaths of dozens of children. The regime's actions reflect a deep-rooted culture of impunity, where those in power are shielded from accountability for the most egregious human rights violations. Iran's government has continued to manipulate the narrative, coercing families of victims to falsely claim their children died by suicide or accidents, covering up their crimes with intimidation and harassment. The systematic violence against peaceful protesters, including children, highlights the Iranian regime's complete disregard for human rights. Despite this, the global community has been slow to act. As Iran's security forces maintain their grip on power, the world's failure to hold them accountable is seen as complicity in these horrific crimes. The deaths of these children, many of whom were simply demanding justice, underscore the brutality of the regime. They are symbols of the countless lives sacrificed in the fight for freedom, justice, and dignity in Iran. One of the darkest, most disturbing events in Sri Lanka's modern history, a massacre that didn't happen in a war zone, but behind the high walls of a prison. This is the story of the Welikada prison massacre, a brutal and haunting episode that unfolded during the chaos of Black July 1983, when the country was gripped by deadly ethnic violence and lawlessness. In July 1983, Sri Lanka was a nation on edge. Tensions between the Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority had been simmering for years, with political mistrust, social discrimination, and rising militancy all fueling the fire. When 13 Sinhalese soldiers were killed by the Tamil Tigers in an ambush in the north, the reaction was swift and violent. Riots exploded across the country in what became known as Black July. Tamil homes, shops, and lives were destroyed by Sinhalese mobs in broad daylight, while authorities either turned a blind eye or failed to intervene. The country was on fire, both literally and figuratively. Amid this chaos stood Welikada Prison in Colombo, one of the largest and most secure prison facilities in the country. Inside its walls were Tamil political prisoners and suspected militants, many of whom had been detained under emergency laws. They were held in state custody, stripped of their freedom, but still under the protection of the law. That protection, however, was tragically absent when the violence reached inside those prison walls. On July 25, 1983, the first massacre occurred. A group of Sinhalese inmates, somehow armed with weapons, launched a brutal and coordinated attack on the Tamil prisoners. What followed was a horrifying bloodbath. 35 Tamil inmates were killed, hacked and beaten to death in what should have been a controlled and secure environment. The guards, whose job was to maintain order and safety, either failed to act or disappeared altogether. Locked doors were inexplicably left open. Weapons that shouldn't have existed in a prison were suddenly in the hands of attackers, and the violence unfolded with disturbing ease. After this massacre, authorities promised tighter security. Extra guards were assigned. Everyone expected the worst to be over. But just 2 days later, on July 27th, the violence returned with horrifying familiarity. Another 18 Tamil prisoners were killed in a second wave of attacks. That brought the total death toll to 53. These were not spontaneous outbursts of violence. They were targeted killings, carried out with shocking coordination and apparent complicity. Despite the scale of the atrocity, accountability never followed. No prison officials faced meaningful consequences. No thorough investigation was made public. The story faded into the background, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and political silence. The massacre became a symbol, not just of racial hatred, but of the utter breakdown of justice and institutional responsibility. The Welikada prison massacre didn't happen in some remote jungle or in the fog of war. It happened in the heart of the capital, under the nose of the state, inside a prison where every movement was supposed to be monitored. The fact that such a tragedy could occur in such a setting spoke volumes about the environment of the time, one where fear, racism, and violence had replaced order and accountability. For the families of the victims, there was no closure, no justice, no one to answer for what happened. The massacre left a permanent scar, not just on those who lost their loved ones, but on the conscience of an entire nation. It exposed the depth of ethnic division and the extent to which state institutions could fail or refuse to protect those in their custody. Even today, the Welikada prison massacre remains one of the most brutal examples of state negligence in Sri Lanka's post-independence history. It stands as a grim reminder of what can happen when hate is allowed to fester and when the guardians of justice become bystanders to murder. This was not just a prison riot. It was an organized massacre that reflected the darkest impulses of a society in collapse. The names of the 53 Tamil prisoners may not be widely known, but their story deserves to be told, not as a forgotten tragedy, but as a warning, a lesson, and a call to never let history repeat itself.
It seemed like just another crisp, sunny day in Karaj, Iran, the kind where 21-year-old Mcatee Karami, a national karate champion with dreams as bold as his Olympic ring tattoo, might have been headed to the gym, not to a protest. But this day, meant to honor the 40-day anniversary of Hadis Najafi's death, would end not with a medal, but with a noose. Karami wasn't some rebel without a cause. He was fighting for basic human rights, part of a massive movement sparked by the tragic death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman arrested for not wearing her hijab properly. Her death ignited protests across Iran, led by the young, the brave, and the done with this oppression crowd. Karami joined in because when you see your people demanding freedom, staying silent feels like betrayal. But according to Iran's ultra-strict regime, fighting for your rights is apparently corruption on earth. Yes, that's a real charge. Karami, along with 39-year-old children's coach Sayed Mohammad Hosseini, was accused of killing a besieged militiaman during the protest. Authorities painted them as rioters, killers. Karami and Hosseini swore they were innocent. The protest in question wasn't some raging battlefield. It was a memorial, a moment of mourning, but things turned dark quickly. Videos showed a lifeless body on a highway, dressed in a besieged uniform. And like a bad crime show without a script, the Iranian government rounded up 16 people, including Karami. No solid evidence, no fair trial, just vague accusations and brutal consequences. Behind closed courtroom doors, yes, literally closed, because transparency apparently isn't trendy in Tehran, Karami and Hosseini were tried in less than a week. They weren't allowed their own lawyers. Forced confessions, likely beaten out of them, became the main proof. Karami's dad begged the authorities in a heartbreaking video to spare his son. "He's a good boy," he said. "He just wanted freedom." Karami had been passionate about karate since he was 11. He was ranked 4th nationally. This was a kid who dreamed of representing his country, not dying because of it. But instead of sparring in a ring, he was thrown into solitary, reportedly tortured, even threatened with sexual violence in prison. Days before his execution, he started a hunger strike, his final silent protest after being denied the lawyer he trusted. And then, without a final goodbye, they hanged him. On January 7th, 2023, the world lost a young life full of promise. No last call to his family, no justice, just silence. The outcry was global. The UN slammed Iran for shocking executions. Celebrities like Jason Momoa, Kate Blanchett, and Bryan Cranston joined a viral campaign. #Stop Executions in Iran. Even the US Special Envoy for Iran tweeted about the horror. People everywhere saw Karami not as a criminal, but as a symbol. A heartbreaking reminder of what happens when fear runs a government. Mohammed Mehdi Karami wasn't just a protester. He was a son, an athlete, a dreamer, and while he died in the fight for justice, he didn't die in vain. His name became a rallying cry, his story a warning, and a hope. A hope that with global pressure, with awareness, with voices louder than the silence of oppression, things can change. If there's one takeaway, protesters should never have to die for demanding freedom. Governments must be held accountable, trials must be fair, and the world must never look away. Because today it was Karami, tomorrow it could be anyone brave enough to speak up.
Oh boy, buckle up, because we're diving into one of the wildest, most chaotic, totally not okay prison meltdowns in US history. The 1980 New Mexico State Penitentiary riot, aka the moment the correctional system threw its hands up and said, "I'm out." Picture this. It's a chilly February weekend in Santa Fe, 1980, and the Penitentiary of New Mexico is basically a pressure cooker of rage, frustration, and very poor life choices. We're talking about a place jam-packed with over 1,100 inmates, many of them stuffed into dormitories like sardines, with zero rehabilitation programs, almost no medical care, and guards who were underpaid, undertrained, and honestly, probably undercaring. So it's no surprise that something was about to snap, and snap it did, harder than a cheap pair of handcuffs. Around 1:40 a.m. on February 2nd, a few inmates decided they'd had enough of the terrible chow and being treated like livestock. They tricked some guards during a late-night head count, jumped them, and boom, within minutes, keys were stolen, control rooms were taken, and just like that, the inmates had the whole joint in their hands. What followed wasn't just a riot. It was a full-blown, apocalyptic, horror movie meets revenge fantasy, minus the popcorn. Inmates went full Mad Max on each other. They broke into cell blocks, especially one called Cell Block 4, which housed the snitches, ex-cops, and folks who didn't exactly make friends in prison. Once the mob got in, it was lights out for a lot of guys. 33 inmates ended up dead, and we're not talking about quiet, peaceful goodbyes. This was gruesome, medieval-level stuff. We're talking torture, dismemberment, and just plain nightmarish violence. It got so intense that some inmates were literally begging guards to save them, and guards, some of whom had been taken hostage, were powerless to stop it. Oh yeah, did I mention the guards? About 12 of them were taken hostage in the early chaos, some beaten, some humiliated, and a few narrowly escaping death thanks to inmates who surprisingly decided to play hero. Not all prisoners were part of the madness. Some actually hid, others tried to help the wounded, and a few even risked their lives to protect staff. So, while the riot was chaos, there were flashes of humanity, buried deep in all that mayhem. Now, how did this whole nightmare end? Well, after 36 hours, yes, 36 hours of non-stop violence, destruction, and probably the worst-smelling facility in America, state police and the National Guard rolled in, gas masks and all. The inmates were exhausted. The prison was wrecked beyond recognition, and the riot eventually fizzled out. But the aftermath, yikes. The facility looked like a war zone. Walls were blackened by fires, furniture was smashed, files were torched, and blood was kind of everywhere. Investigators walked in and probably thought, yeah, we broke prison. The riot exposed just how broken the prison system was in New Mexico. Overcrowded, underfunded, mismanaged, and running on fumes. The government couldn't sweep this one under the rug. Reforms followed, reports were written, heads rolled, and the riot became a grim lesson in what happens when you ignore a boiling pot until it explodes in your face. So next time you think your workplace is chaotic, just remember, at least your coworkers aren't literally trying to eat each other. The 1980 New Mexico State Penitentiary riot, where everything that could go wrong absolutely did, and then somehow got even worse. On the morning of July 29, 2024, Isaias Jacob Wenmeyer Gonzalez, a 15-year-old from San Francisco Zulia State, was just another teenager excited for his 15th birthday party. He stepped out that day to rehearse a dance routine with friends, his mind far from the chaos about to unfold. But as the sun began to dip lower, the streets outside his rehearsal space erupted into protest. It was the day after the controversial Venezuelan presidential election, and many, including Isaias, were demanding justice for what they believed was a rigged result. Despite the tense atmosphere, Isaias, caught up in the heat of the moment, joined the crowd outside the Matias Losada High School to protest the re-election of Nicolas Maduro. Little did he know that his innocent act of defiance would be his last. The protests were sparked by the announcement of Maduro's victory, which many believed lacked transparency and legitimacy. International observers, including the United Nations and the Carter Center, had raised alarms, claiming the process was deeply flawed. Yet, people like Isaias were determined to make their voices heard, fighting for a fair election and the hope of a better future. But as the evening wore on, violence erupted. National Guard troops on motorbikes clashed with protesters, attempting to break up the crowds. Amid the chaos, a group of armed pro-government colectivos joined in, further escalating the situation. In a tragic turn of events, a bullet struck Isaias in the neck. He was rushed to the hospital, but the young protester died shortly after due to blood loss. His family was left shattered, especially his sister, who couldn't comprehend how a peaceful, carefree day had ended in such horror. He was a child who did not deserve to die, she said, her words hanging heavy in the air. Isaias's story is not just one of tragic loss, it's a stark reminder of the dangers faced by those willing to stand up for their beliefs in the face of oppression. Isaias, like many others who perished in the protests, became a symbol of the cost of fighting for justice in a broken system. His death, alongside the killings of at least 23 others during the protests, shined a light on the brutality unleashed by Venezuelan authorities against their own citizens. These young people weren't just fighting for political power, they were fighting for the basic right to be heard, to have their votes counted, and to live in a country where human rights were respected. While his death was senseless and brutal, the love Isaias's family and community had for him didn't fade. It fueled the ongoing struggle for justice. He may have died too young, but his memory lives on as a call for change, a plea for a future where no one else has to suffer in the same way. What's clear from Isaias's story, and the stories of those like him, is the need for accountability. The international community must act swiftly to ensure that these human rights violations are not swept under the rug. Venezuela needs transparency, and the people need to know their voices matter. It's heartbreaking that so many have lost their lives for something so simple yet so fundamental, the right to live free from fear and oppression. So while Isaias's life was tragically cut short, his legacy is one of courage and love. His death is a reminder that these protests were not just about politics. They were about justice, and they were about a brighter, freer future for all Venezuelans. Let's honor his memory by pushing for the changes needed to prevent such tragedies, and remember that every person who died in these protests did so because they believed in a better tomorrow.
It seemed like just another summer evening in Minneapolis. The sun was dipping low, music played softly from a speaker nearby, and Diona Marie Kneidek stood with her fellow protesters on West Lake Street, fighting for something she believed in with every ounce of her soul: justice. But what started as a peaceful protest turned into a night of horror, and for Diona, it would be her last. At 31, Diona wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a mom to 2 daughters, a caregiver by profession, and a warrior for social justice by passion. On June 13th, 2021, she joined a protest demanding answers and accountability for the police killing of Winston Smith, a black man fatally shot by law enforcement earlier that month. The protest had been ongoing since June 3rd, and Diona had shown up day after day, not for the spotlight, but because she believed people deserved better. And that night, she took it one step further. She used her own car to create a barricade, shielding her fellow demonstrators from traffic. She literally put herself between danger and the people. But then, danger came anyway. Fast, loud, and deadly. Out of nowhere, a speeding SUV plowed through the barricades and into the crowd. The driver, Nicholas Kraus, a 35-year-old with a rap sheet longer than a CVS receipt, had 5 prior DUI convictions. And that night, he was reportedly high, reckless, and according to prosecutors, very aware of what he was doing. Kraus later admitted he intentionally hit the gas. He wanted to clear the barricades. Yeah, like he was in some kind of twisted video game. Except this wasn't Grand Theft Auto, this was real life. And that SUV hit Diona's parked car so hard it became a deadly weapon. She died, and 3 other people were injured. Witnesses said it looked like the car actually accelerated as it approached the demonstration. The aftermath was gut-wrenching. Flowers, candles, and signs flooded the sidewalk where she fell. Her family, friends, and strangers gathered in a sea of tears, chants, and love. The community didn't just lose a protester that night, they lost a hero. Diona had been working as a program manager for a healthcare group, raising her daughters and giving her energy to causes that matter: racial justice, police accountability, and ending gun violence. The man responsible, Kraus, was arrested, charged, and eventually pleaded guilty. He claimed he didn't know a protest was happening, but evidence showed otherwise. Surveillance footage, witness accounts, and even his own statements told a darker story. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison for unintentional second-degree murder and assault with a deadly weapon. Justice, sort of. But no sentence can bring back a mother, a friend, or a fighter like Diona. Her funeral in Rush City, Minnesota drew crowds from across the state. She was remembered not just for how she died, but how she lived, with purpose, kindness, and fearless conviction. Her daughters, now growing up without her, will always know that their mom died doing something brave, something meaningful. So what can we take from this? First, let's never forget that protesting for justice shouldn't be a death sentence. Cities need better protections for peaceful demonstrators. More safety, less risk. And second, let's remember Diona Marie, not just as a name in a headline, but as a woman who believed so fiercely in a better world that she literally stood in the way of harm to protect others. In the end, her life wasn't lost in vain. Her story lit a fire, and her legacy, that lives on in every chant, every march, and every person who dares to stand up and say, enough is enough.
Let's rewind to October 2nd, 1992, Sao Paulo, Brazil. A day that turned one of the world's most overcrowded prisons into the site of one of the deadliest prison massacres in modern history. Welcome to the twisted, tragic tale of Carandiru Penitentiary, where a prison brawl escalated into a full-blown bloodbath, all thanks to a keep calm and call the military approach that went spectacularly wrong. Now, Carandiru wasn't your average prison. It was more like a chaotic, concrete jungle crammed with over 8,000 inmates, all squeezed into a space built for way fewer. Picture wall-to-wall prisoners, barely enough room to breathe, and the kind of living conditions that would make even a cockroach file a complaint. Diseases were rampant, the food was tragic, and the vibe? Perpetual tension. You didn't need a crystal ball to see something bad was brewing. And then, boom. A fight breaks out in Pavilion 9, which was already known as the Hot Mess Express of the entire facility. This wasn't an unusual event. Fights were basically part of the daily itinerary, but this one spiraled fast. The prison staff hit panic mode, lost control, and instead of trying to calm things down, they did what any totally not overreacting system would do. They called in the military police. Because when your overcrowded prison explodes into chaos, what could go wrong with storming in hundreds of armed officers? Well, a lot. Over 300 military police officers entered the prison, and what was supposed to be a security operation turned into a slaughter. When the dust settled, 111 prisoners were dead, most of them unarmed, many reportedly executed in cold blood. Some were gunned down in their cells, others were shot while trying to surrender. And the kicker? Not a single cop was killed or seriously hurt. That wasn't a clash. It was a massacre in every sense of the word. Leading this little horror show was Colonel Uberatan Guimaraes, who somehow went from guy who led a bloodbath to politician with a seat in office. He was convicted for his role years later. But don't cheer yet, because the conviction got overturned. And in a plot twist straight out of a crime drama, he was found dead in 2006 under mysterious circumstances. No spoilers, but yeah, things got messy. The massacre triggered outrage both inside and outside Brazil. Human rights groups were furious. Journalists and activists sounded the alarm. The justice system was dragged through the mud for how long it took to hold anyone accountable. And even when some officers were finally put on trial, 2 decades later, the process felt more like a confusing soap opera than real justice. Carandiru itself was eventually shut down in 2002 and demolished. In its place stands a park and a memorial, a quiet tribute to the lives lost in a building that became a symbol of everything wrong with the prison system. Oh, and if this story sounds like something straight out of a gritty movie, that's because it is. In 2003, filmmaker Hector Babenco released Carandiru, a film that dives deep into prison life leading up to the massacre. It's raw, it's powerful, and it doesn't sugarcoat a thing. At the end of the day, the Carandiru massacre isn't just a dark moment in Brazil's past. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when authority loses its moral compass, and when lives behind bars are treated like they don't matter. It's brutal, it's real, and it's a story that demands to be remembered. It all started like any other day. Bright skies, a little heat in the air, and the kind of energy that builds up when people come together for something bigger than themselves. In Austin, Texas, 20-year-old Justin Howell, a student at Texas State University, was ready to make his voice heard. The Black Lives Matter movement was sweeping the nation, and like thousands of others, Justin was marching for justice, equality, and an end to police brutality. He was part of a wave of protests triggered by the tragic death of George Floyd just days earlier. It was a simple aim, demanding accountability for the officers involved and a world where no one had to fear the very people sworn to protect them. The protests in Austin, like in many other cities, were largely peaceful. But as tensions built and emotions ran high, something tragic unfolded. On May 31, 2020, Justin was standing in the middle of the crowd, fighting for change when an officer from the Austin Police Department fired a less lethal beanbag round. The officer missed the intended target, and the round struck Justin in the head, causing a catastrophic injury. Justin was left critically injured with a fractured skull and severe brain damage. Fellow protesters quickly tried to rush him to safety, only to be met with more police fire. The chaos that followed left Justin's life forever altered, and yet his story was far from over. Though his situation was dire, the protests that followed Justin's injury became a focal point for many. What was supposed to be a peaceful demand for change had now escalated into something far more sinister. The police were supposed to be keeping the peace, but instead they were becoming a force of fear. This tragic incident highlighted the risks of militarized policing and the need for reform. The very people who were supposed to protect Justin had become a part of the problem. But even in the face of such devastation, Justin's story isn't one of hopelessness. He became a symbol of the struggle, the face of what happens when peaceful protests are met with violent suppression. His journey from that moment on was painful, but it sparked conversations, change, and a renewed commitment to justice. People rallied around Justin, and his case became another rallying cry for those demanding a more just society. The world began to take notice, not just of the injustice that led to his injury, but of the resilience of a generation that refused to back down. Justin's story reminds us that no matter how dark things seem, the fight for justice is one worth fighting. His injuries were a brutal reminder of the need for reform, but they also reminded the world of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the road ahead seems perilous. The measures that need to be taken to prevent such incidents are clear: more accountability, more transparency, and an end to excessive force in peaceful demonstrations. In the end, Justin Howell may not have been just another face in the crowd. He was, and still is, a beacon of hope, a young man who, in the face of violence, stood up for the values of equality and justice. While his body was broken by the system, his spirit became an unbreakable force. The world may have witnessed his suffering, but it also witnessed his strength and the love from his community, which continued to support him as he recovered. Justin Howell may have been one of the most horrific casualties of the protests, but his sacrifice wasn't in vain. He will always be remembered, not for how he fell, but for how he fought, and that's a fight we all need to carry on.
It was supposed to be a day of celebration, sunshine, parades, and fireworks. March 26th marked 50 years since Bangladesh broke free from Pakistan. But for many, this golden jubilee felt more like a slap in the face. The guest of honor, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and not everyone was rolling out the red carpet. For protester after protester, it started off like any regular Friday. Prayers at the mosque, a few handmade posters, and the passion to fight for what they believed in. But little did they know, this would be their last stand. So what was all the fuss about? Modi, though seen as a powerful global leader by many, has a very controversial past, especially when it comes to Muslims. Many in Bangladesh viewed him as the butcher of Gujarat for his alleged role in the 2002 riots in India that left hundreds dead. So when he showed up to party in Dhaka, protesters, mainly student groups and the Islamist organization Hefazat-e-Islam, weren't having it. Their message was simple: Modi, you're not welcome here. Their goal: cancel the invitation and send him packing. At first, it was peaceful, chanting, waving banners, even waving shoes in protest, because in South Asia that's major disrespect. But then, chaos. Picture this: protesters at Baitul Mukarram Mosque just finished Friday prayers. The air was tense. Supporters of the ruling Awami League and its student wing were lurking, ready for a brawl. Suddenly fists flew, rubber bullets rained down, and within minutes, a peaceful crowd turned into a war zone. Police joined in with batons and tear gas as protesters screamed and scattered. Over 140 people ended up in the hospital just that day. But the violence didn't stop in Dhaka. The news of the mosque attack reached Hathazari in Chittagong, an area known for its fiery student groups. They took to the streets in rage, but police were waiting. When the protesters neared the police station, things turned ugly fast. Guns were drawn. 4 protesters died on the spot. Bang. Just like that, young lives gone. Meanwhile, in Brahmanbaria, another protester, just a teen trying to make his voice heard, lost his life when Hefazat members stormed a railway station. The town erupted. Highways blocked, police stations attacked, government buildings set on fire. Protesters said they were fed up. The government responded with brute force. Villagers trying to protest were gunned down. A madrasa student was killed when Awami League thugs stormed his school. By the end of it all, at least 14 people were dead. Some say it was more. Hundreds injured. Facebook was shut down. News spread like wildfire anyway. Amnesty International wasn't quiet either. They called it a bloody crackdown and slammed the Bangladeshi government for using excessive force. Protesters weren't armed with rifles. They had signs and sandals. And here's the kicker: these kids weren't criminals. They were students, dreamers, fighters. They believed in something bigger than themselves and stood up, even when it cost them everything. So what can we learn from this? First, the right to protest peacefully matters. Governments need to protect that, not punish it. Second, using force to silence youth never works. It just makes their message louder. And third, heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear sandals and carry signs. These young people were mourned as martyrs by many. Their names may not be in your textbooks, but they're etched into the soul of Bangladesh's struggle for justice. And no matter how brutal the response, the spirit of standing up against injustice lives on.
One of the most shocking and brutal prison riots in Brazil's recent history, the Altamira prison riot of 2019. This wasn't just a scuffle behind bars. It was a full-scale eruption of violence, fueled by gang rivalry, overcrowding, and a prison system that was already hanging by a thread. What happened in Altamira shocked the world, and for good reason. So, it all started on July 29, 2019, in the Centro de Recuperação Regional de Altamira, located in the northern state of Pará, Brazil. On the surface, it was a typical morning inside the facility, at least as typical as things can be in an overcrowded prison. But beneath the surface, tension was bubbling between two major rival gangs, the local Commando Class A, CCA, and the nationally feared Comando Vermelho, CV, from Rio de Janeiro. At around 7 a.m., that tension exploded into violence. Members of the CCA launched a surprise attack on CV members, catching them off guard. But this wasn't just fists and threats. The attackers locked a group of CV members in a section of the prison and set it on fire. Flames tore through the makeshift cell blocks, many of which were modified shipping containers, and smoke filled the air. The heat was intense and the fire quickly spread out of control. The result? Absolute horror. 57 inmates died inside the prison, many due to smoke inhalation, but at least 16 were brutally decapitated. That level of violence is hard to even imagine. The aftermath was worse. 4 more inmates died during transportation to other facilities, bringing the final death toll to 62. The riot wasn't just deadly, it was savage. Prison staff were powerless to stop it. There were only 33 guards overseeing more than 340 inmates that day, more than double the prison's intended capacity of 163. 2 staff members were briefly taken hostage during the chaos, but were later released. For hours, police forces and emergency responders couldn't even get inside the building due to the flames, and the violence still unfolding. It was a complete breakdown of control. This riot didn't come out of nowhere. It was the product of years of neglect, systemic overcrowding, poor infrastructure, and unchecked gang influence within Brazil's prisons. The conditions at Altamira were a disaster waiting to happen. When you cram hundreds of gang-affiliated inmates into a small, understaffed space and then house them in flammable, poorly ventilated units, it's not a question of if something will go wrong, but when. In the days that followed, authorities scrambled to respond. 46 inmates were transferred to other facilities, 10 of them to high-security prisons. Officials promised to review prison conditions and address gang-related violence, but for many critics it was too little, too late. This riot wasn't the first, and sadly, it wasn't the last. Brazil's prison system has long struggled with violence, overcrowding, and corruption. The Altamira massacre forced the world to take a hard look at what was happening behind closed doors. It became a symbol, not just of a failed facility, but of a failed system, and until those root causes are addressed, incidents like this will continue to happen. So, while it's easy to see this as just another headline from a faraway place, the Altamira riot is a harsh reminder of what can happen when broken systems are ignored. It's not just a story about criminals behind bars. It's a story about policy, humanity, and the high cost of neglect. On a warm summer morning, June 19, 2020, 65-year-old Reagan Russell, an animal rights activist from Hamilton, Ontario, set out on what seemed like a normal day of peaceful protest. For decades, Reagan had been the voice for animals, fighting against cruelty in all its forms. That day, she was part of a group from Toronto Pig Save, an organization dedicated to raising awareness about the treatment of pigs, standing outside Fearman's Pork Slaughterhouse in Burlington, Ontario. They were there to give water to the pigs being transported to their grim fate, hoping to make a small, humane gesture in an often brutal system. Reagan's activism wasn't limited to just one cause. She was a passionate advocate for animal rights, women's rights, and Black Lives Matter, never afraid to challenge the status quo. She believed in breaking unjust laws to change the world, much like the suffragists or those who fought against slavery. To Reagan, protesting wasn't just about making noise. It was about making a real difference, about standing up for what was right. Her journey as an activist began at 24 with a protest against seal culling, and since then she dedicated her life to speaking out for those who couldn't. That fateful morning, as she and her fellow activists watered the pigs in transit, the situation took a tragic turn. Reagan, after giving the pigs a much-needed drink, stepped aside to allow a supply truck to pass. But as the truck carrying pigs turned into the slaughterhouse driveway, the driver, apparently unaware of Reagan's position, proceeded forward. Reagan, standing at the edge of the driveway, made a peace sign to the driver, unaware that this simple act of solidarity would be her last. The truck, moving at a slow speed of 12.7 miles per hour, ran over her and dragged her several yards before finally stopping, her life extinguished instantly. Reagan's tragic death was ruled an accident, and the driver, Andrew Blake, was convicted of careless driving, causing death. He received a sentence of probation and a fine, but for many, the legal repercussions didn't feel sufficient for the loss of someone so dedicated to her cause. Her death sparked outrage and sparked international protests in her memory, from die-ins in London to sit-ins in Italy, even inspiring a rally in downtown Toronto. Though the world mourned Reagan, her spirit lived on in the work she began. Joaquin Phoenix, a fellow animal rights advocate, led a protest in her honor outside Fearman's Pork Slaughterhouse, pledging to continue the fight she had started. Animal rights groups across the globe, from India to the United States, rallied together, vowing that Reagan's death would not be in vain. Her passing also sparked a legal battle over the law that led to her death, with advocacy groups seeking to overturn the legislation that restricted protests like the one she had participated in. Reagan's legacy wasn't just about the protests, though. It was about the lives she touched and the change she inspired. Posthumously, she was awarded the Dr. John Rumney Award for her dedication to animal rights, and a short film about her life was showcased at the International Vegan Film Festival. Her story continues to inspire activists worldwide, reminding us of the power of standing up for what's right, even when it seems impossible. While Reagan's death was tragic, it became a catalyst for greater awareness and action. The cruelty she fought against still exists, but her memory serves as a beacon of hope. As we honor her life, we are reminded of the importance of compassion, justice, and standing up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Reagan may be gone, but her legacy is very much alive, inspiring a new generation to fight for a better world.
Ashley Babbitt, a 35-year-old U.S. Air Force veteran, was fatally shot by a Capitol police officer on January 6, 2021 during the storming of the United States Capitol. Babbitt was among the crowd of Donald Trump supporters who breached the Capitol in an attempt to stop Congress from certifying Joe Biden's 2020 presidential victory. Despite repeated warnings, Babbitt tried to climb through a shattered window into the Speaker's lobby, a restricted area near where lawmakers were being evacuated. She was shot in the left shoulder by Lieutenant Michael Byrd and later died at Washington Hospital Center. Babbitt served 12 years in the Air Force, including deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kuwait, and was part of the DC Air National Guard's Capitol Guardians unit. After leaving the military, she worked security jobs and eventually co-owned a pool servicing company in California with her second husband, Aaron Babbitt. Over time, Babbitt's political views radicalized. She supported Trump, became a vocal follower of the QAnon conspiracy theory, and was active in the Stop the Steal movement. On social media, particularly Twitter under the handle @CommonAshSense, Babbitt heavily engaged with far-right content, often reposting messages promoting conspiracy theories and calls to action. She announced plans to attend the January 6th rally in DC, and on the eve of the event tweeted that the storm is here, referencing a central QAnon belief in a coming reckoning against political elites. On the day of the attack, rioters overran police barriers and stormed the Capitol, causing Congress to halt proceedings and evacuate. At approximately 2:44 p.m., Babbitt reached a barricaded door leading to the Speaker's lobby. Lawmakers and staff were still inside, some trapped. As officers withdrew from the barricade, a rioter smashed a window. Babbitt, wearing a Trump flag as a cape, attempted to climb through. Lieutenant Byrd, who was on the other side, fired a single shot that struck her. Emergency services rendered aid, but she died soon after. Reports later confirmed Babbitt was unarmed, though a folding knife was found in her pocket. The Department of Justice and Capitol Police both cleared Byrd of wrongdoing, determining the shooting was justified and in line with department policy. Byrd later explained that his actions likely saved lives, noting he could not retreat and did not know whether Babbitt was armed. Babbitt's death quickly became a focal point in political debates. While initially few Republicans criticized the shooting, over time some conservatives began portraying her as a martyr. Trump repeatedly invoked her death, calling it unjustified and describing Byrd as a thug. Fox News hosts and GOP lawmakers like Paul Gosar claimed she had been executed. In contrast, others, including Representative Liz Cheney, defended Byrd's actions and warned against glorifying political violence. The incident was also seized upon by conspiracy theorists, including QAnon supporters who claim Babbitt was still alive or that her death was staged. International figures like Vladimir Putin and Brazil's then foreign minister Ernesto Araujo condemned the shooting. In January 2024, Judicial Watch filed a $30 million wrongful death lawsuit on behalf of Babbitt's husband, citing government liability. Though it came after the federal statute of limitations, her lawyers argue pandemic-related extensions or state law may apply. In 2025, Trump, then in a second presidential term, said he would consider a settlement. Babbitt's mother, Mickey Withoft, became politically active following her daughter's death, attending rallies and supporting January 6 defendants. She has described Babbitt as a hero who died defending democracy.
Let's rewind to 1971, to a small town in upstate New York where something explosive was brewing inside the walls of Attica Correctional Facility. Overcrowded, under-resourced, and racially divided, the prison had become a pressure cooker. Inmates were living under harsh conditions, only one shower a week, barely any medical care, censored mail, and a diet that could have made cardboard look appetizing. More than half the prison population was black or Latino, but almost all the guards were white, and racism was practically baked into the system. Tensions had been simmering for years, and on September 9th, the lid finally blew off. It started with a scuffle between inmates and guards, but what followed was far more than just a fight. Over 1,200 inmates took control of the prison's D-yard, taking 42 staff members hostage. But instead of descending into chaos, the inmates organized. They issued a clear and powerful list of 27 demands, calling for basic human rights: decent food, health care, education, fair treatment, and amnesty for the uprising. They weren't asking for luxury, they were asking for dignity. For 4 tense days, the prison yard turned into a political stage. The inmates brought in observers, activists, journalists, even public figures like civil rights attorney William Kunstler and Black Panther leader Bobby Seale to help with negotiations. Their message was firm, but peaceful. They were determined to be heard. But outside the walls, Governor Nelson Rockefeller refused to meet the inmates face-to-face, despite public pressure. And on the morning of September 13th, without warning, he gave the green light for a violent retake. In came hundreds of heavily armed state troopers, correction officers, and sheriff's deputies. Tear gas rained down. Guns opened fire. Chaos erupted. In just 15 minutes, 39 people were killed, 29 inmates and 10 hostages. And here's the chilling truth. Every single hostage was killed by law enforcement gunfire, not by the inmates. Despite this, officials initially claimed the prisoners had murdered the hostages, an outright lie that was quickly exposed by autopsies. The public was outraged. What followed was a storm of lawsuits, investigations, and long-overdue scrutiny of the U.S. prison system. The Attica uprising became a defining moment, a symbol of resistance against inhumane treatment behind bars, and a stark reminder of how quickly justice can unravel when fear takes over. The prisoners had tried to negotiate. They had asked to be heard. Instead, their cries were met with bullets. Decades later, Attica is still more than just the name of a prison. It's a powerful warning, a call to remember what happens when systems fail and voices are ignored. It forced the nation to confront ugly truths about racism, inequality, and brutality in places most people never see. And while some reforms did come in its wake, many of the same issues, overcrowding, neglect, abuse, still linger in prisons across the country. It was a bright and seemingly ordinary day on February 20th, 2021, in Mandalay, Myanmar. The streets buzzed with energy as protests continued against the military junta that had taken power. Among the passionate demonstrators was 16-year-old Yan Tun, a young worker who had dreams of a brighter future. Yan wasn't just protesting for himself, he was standing up for his country and his people, protesting the military coup that had taken control and imprisoned elected leaders. That day, Yan was in Thinbagyen, where he was volunteering to help injured protesters. It seemed like any other moment of defiance, but it quickly turned into something far darker. As protesters gathered, tensions escalated. The military, desperate to crush the dissent, began firing live rounds into the crowd. Yan, with a heart full of courage, rushed to assist those who had been struck by the bullets. In the midst of the chaos, a shot rang out, targeting Yan directly. The bullet struck him in the head, ending his life at the tender age of 16. It was a tragic, unnecessary death that shocked the nation and the world. Yan Tun became a symbol of the brutality faced by those fighting for democracy and freedom. His death was one of the first instances of bloodshed during what would come to be known as Myanmar's Spring Revolution, and it would ignite even more anger and determination in the protesters. The United States Embassy quickly condemned the violence, describing the killing as a deeply troubling act of aggression. But despite the pain and heartbreak, Yan's death wasn't in vain. His image became iconic. Protesters would carry his face, chanting his name and carrying on his fight. Yan's final words, "I don't think I can make it. Remember my face. Say my name. May my courage live on. Continue this fight for me, for I was taken away too soon," echoed through the streets, a rallying cry for all who still believed in the cause. In a small act of defiance and remembrance, the 41st Street Market, where Yan had worked, was renamed in his honor. The market, which had once been a symbol of mundane work and survival, became a place of tribute. Yan may have been just a child, but he had grown into a powerful symbol of resistance, a martyr for the cause of democracy in Myanmar. Though his life was tragically cut short, Yan Tun was loved by many, cherished by those who fought beside him, and remembered by those who followed his path. His legacy serves as a reminder of the sacrifices that young people have made throughout history, fighting for a better world. His story is a call to action, urging us to stand against injustice and ensure that such senseless loss of life never happens again. Let's honor his memory by continuing to push for peace and fairness in every corner of the world.
It started off like a regular summer night in Louisville, Kentucky. June 1st, 2020, warm air, good vibes, and the smell of smoky barbecue drifting from Yaya's BBQ Shack, run by none other than David Mcatee, a local legend, a man with a spatula in one hand and a heart full of kindness in the other. He wasn't just serving ribs, he was serving hope in a neighborhood that needed it. David wasn't out protesting that night. He wasn't chanting, holding signs, or clashing with cops. In fact, people say the crowd across the street at Dino's Food Mart wasn't protesting either. It was just a regular neighborhood hangout, a We Survived Monday type of gathering. And David, he was doing what he always did, feeding people, even cops. Yeah, that's right. David fed the police for free. That's how chill and respected he was. But this night, it took a turn no one saw coming. Earlier, Louisville had imposed a 9 p.m. curfew thanks to the nationwide protests after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's deaths. So the Louisville Metro Police Department and the Kentucky National Guard rolled in to clear the area. Except it wasn't peaceful. According to witnesses, the cops and soldiers boxed people in, creating chaos. People started running. Pepper balls were fired, illegally by the way, directly at people instead of the ground like they were supposed to. One even nearly hit David's niece. That's when things went from tense to tragic. David, beloved, peaceful David, reached for his gun. Surveillance videos later showed he lifted his arm, possibly firing a warning shot. In the chaos, 2 officers and 2 guardsmen unloaded at least 19 bullets in his direction. One shot from a National Guard soldier struck him in the chest. He died right outside his restaurant. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't leading a riot. He was trying to protect his family and his food stand. And that was his final act. The most gut-wrenching part, his body lay there for over 12 hours. The community gathered around, stunned, some crying, others furious. Someone sang "Amazing Grace." It felt less like a crime scene and more like a wake, right on the sidewalk where he used to serve plates piled high with barbecue. Then the truth started unraveling. Turns out the officers' body cams were turned off against department rules. A few days later, the police chief was fired. The footage that did exist showed the pepper balls were fired first, right into the crowd, breaking protocol. And David, lab tests confirmed he was killed by a single bullet from a guardsman. The investigation dragged on. No charges were filed. People were furious. Even David's brother got arrested at a protest demanding justice. Meanwhile, an officer involved had posted a super cringy and honestly disturbing photo on social media, bragging about protesters getting hit with pepper balls. Classy. But here's the thing, David Mcatee wasn't just a victim. He was a hero. He made peace where others stirred chaos. He fed everyone, cops and civilians alike. He was proof that being kind and standing up for your community isn't weakness, it's strength. His death lit a fire under Louisville and beyond, sparking conversations about over-policing, accountability, and how easily Black lives can be erased, even when you're not doing anything wrong. So what can we learn from this? First, justice isn't just about punishment, it's about policy, accountability, and body cams that actually stay on. Second, peaceful communities don't need military-level crackdowns. They need understanding and respect. And finally, if you ever feel small, remember David. He wasn't a politician or a protest leader. He was a guy with a grill who made a big difference.